Hello, everybody. It's so good to be talking to you today and coming into your homes. And I hope that Jesus gets bigger, the cross works better, the resurrection is central, and scriptures get bigger, not smaller. We're going to open up the Bible today, which I love to do. It's one of my favorite things to do. And I want to tell you the story of one of my heroes, a lady named Ruth. She is perhaps the bravest person in the whole Bible, but definitely in the conversation for being up there with the bravest people who's ever lived, especially when you understand the history underneath this story. I want to focus on one part of this story. I want to talk to you about what faith looks like in liminal, troublesome space. And if that describes anything that's going on here, it is that. The basics of the story is that there was a family of Jews that went to live in Moab because there wasn't enough food. Tragic. And then they later come back only to remember and realize that Moabites aren't allowed in Bethlehem because it was written into Jewish law because of an incident that happened between the Moabite king Balaam and Balak, who hired Balaam to curse the Israelites. And so Moses made a law that no Moabite was allowed. And so it creates a lot of tension in the story in that Ruth is a Moabite. And what do you do with a Moabite who wants to be a Jew when the law forbids her presence? And so there's a lot of tension in this story. There's a lot of triumph, but it's a story of an ascent. It starts really bad and ends up well. At its most base thing, it's the story of the reconciliation of family. Abraham and Lot had to split ways, and Abraham becomes the father of the Israelites, and Lot becomes the father of the Moabites. And so when Ruth and Boaz get together eventually, it's sort of the reconciliation of an entire family. So you have all this going on. And in the story, you have all kinds of themes, like, what do you do with someone who can make no money? What do you do with someone who has lack? And what do you do with that person when their lack is exemplified by their race being cursed in Jewish law? And what do you do with that? And so what they did in the Jewish culture is they allowed the poor to winnow behind the harvesters. And so when something was dropped, they could pick it up. So they could pick up the grapes that had fallen and things like this. It was a measure of benevolence and generosity to the poor in that time. And in this story, Naomi has to step in and remind Ruth that the main goal of the story is to get you a man. Like, you've got to get married because women not attached to men in those days, they weren't even considered people. They didn't know what to do with them, right? And so Ruth has to keep her eyes on the prize. So Naomi essentially says, this is my caricature of it. Naomi says, hey, that guy over there, his name's Boaz. He's rich, he's kind, and he's single, which is the trifecta of awesome, right? Rich, kind, single. What else do you want? And so Ruth says, well, what do I do to get his attention? It turns out that the language of attraction is quite universal and very effective. And so I'm going to read this passage, and I want to focus on one sentence in it because there's so many places we could go that I think applies for us in our time right now. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, this is Ruth chapter 3. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. In other words, this single, rich, kind guy, I know where he is. And he's going to spend the night there tonight. Because in those days, they couldn't lock those things up. You had to stay the night with the harvest so that it didn't get robbed. And so that's where he's going to be. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself. In other words, take a bath, put on some perfume, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she replied, all that you say, I will do. So she went to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, that's called tipsy at least, and he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night. So if you're a note taker, that's the phrase. In the middle of the night. The man was startled and turned over. And behold, a woman lay at his feet and he said, who are you? And she answered, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. This is an obvious sexual reference. The word wings there is the corner of a garment. So she's saying, spread your wings over me. This was a common sexual metaphor that is being clearly told here. And actually, from a pragmatic point of view, it makes a lot of sense. Ruth knows just enough of Jewish law to go, if you're the closest redeemer, then you have to redeem me. Now, what she doesn't know is that the kinsman redeemer law had to be redeemed in the middle of the day at the town gate in front of 10 witnesses. She's trying to pull this off in the middle of the night by simply just coming on to him. And Boaz fixes it up. So in the middle of the night, the man was startled and turned over. I'm Ruth, and for you're now my redeemer. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. So let's go through this story and find ourselves identifying with Ruth and at times Boaz, and then ask ourselves, what does that mean to live in faith today? One, the most elemental goal of this story is to get Ruth a husband. Naomi is being very aggressive to make this happen. And that makes a lot of sense. According to one story from Jewish tradition, Boaz is older and had experienced a tragedy where his children had died. Number three, the threshing floor was a place to process the harvest. Well, often the workers would just sleep there. It is alluded to in this passage that this was a man-only place. So Ruth bathes, cleans up, dresses nice, puts on perfume. She then waits for him to be tipsy, and she climbs under the covers with him. Naomi's plan, number 5, is based on pure pragmatism and is filled with sexual metaphor. Because to uncover someone's feet was a metaphor for sexuality. To lift the corner of a garment was a metaphor for sexuality. Naomi's plan is dangerous because it attempts to bypass the next of kin and the law by moving this in private instead of public at the gate, according to Deuteronomy 25. It is a shortcut to God's plan. In Deuteronomy 22, verse 30, this is what it says. A man shall not take his father's wife so that he does not uncover his father's skirt, kanape, the uncovering of the skirt, the lifting of the garment. This is what's going on here, and it all has to do with this kinsman redeemer law. So there's a couple things going on. One, to uncover the feet, to spread the corners of the garment over me. She says, I am Ruth, your servant. You're my redeemer. There's all these things we could look at, and they're worth looking at on their own. But I want to look at that one phrase, that this all happened in the middle of the night. In the middle of the night is a common Jewish literary device to describe meaningful things. I'll give you a couple examples. There was this time that Jacob, who was the forefather of all of Israel, he wrestled with God, and his wrestling with God was the middle of the night. So much so that they changed his name to Israel, one who wrestles with God, so that God's chosen people are people who wrestle with him, and anyone who wrestles with God are God's chosen people. So I think a question we could ask is are we wrestling with God right now? There's another instance where the Passover happened in Egypt in the middle of the night. Scripture says in the middle of the night, Jesus was arrested. Scripture says that in the middle of the night, Samson figured out how to escape for Gaza. Scripture also says in Jesus' parables that it's in the middle of the night that the unprepared virgins were caught by surprise. So what is this in the middle of the night? In the middle of the night is a regular literary device used in the ancient world to evince a climactic point to move us through a transition. It's when you're approaching a T junction, not a Y junction. It's you can't go forward, you can't go back. There is a middle of the night, and it's a common metaphor used throughout Scripture, and it's used here. This is Ruth's point of no return. It's point of no return. You've went into the men-only threshing floor, and you have sexually come on to a guy knowing that legally he's the redeemer and he should redeem you, but that's all you know. You don't know that he's actually not the closest relative, so it was illegal. You don't know that the kinsman redeemer law had to be done in the middle of the day at the town gate in front of 10 witnesses. You don't know that. You're trying to pull this off in the middle of the night, which would have made it illegal and the death penalty. And it's not like they needed more of a reason to hate a Moabite. There is a lot of stuff going on here that is making this a T junction, not a Y junction. And so it's the middle of the night. In this story, if Boaz goes one way, Jesus is eventually born. If Boaz goes the other, Ruth is killed for her breaking protocol, and we're not here. This is a sliding doors moment. Boaz has a choice to act with kindness and chesed and love and grace and be someone who fulfills Scripture instead of being right about one verse that says she's not allowed to do that. If Boaz is someone who's ultimately concerned with being right about one verse, we're not here today. But he chose to fulfill Scripture instead of being right about one verse. And that is moving. To fulfill Scripture is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he does that. And because he treats Ruth that way, eventually David is born and Jesus is born. If Boaz goes one way, Jesus is eventually born. If Boaz goes the other, Ruth is killed for breaking protocol and we're not here. Now, a couple thoughts about the middle of the night. Number one, darkness is normal. You're not supposed to know all the answers. And I wonder if there's some of us right now who are in a middle of the night moment. Can't go forward, can't go back, and we're stuck. We're absolutely stuck, and we're at the whim of things we can't control. Darkness is normal. You're not supposed to know all the answers. Number two, the middle of the night will pass. It will pass. Do not panic and make decisions that make matters worse. Darkness is normal. Not supposed to know all the answers. It will pass. Don't panic and make decisions that make matters worse. Three, keep first things first. Get your natural world in order. One of the things we learned from Ruth is she was known for being a hard worker, having integrity, not taking advantage of people's generosity, so much so that Boaz says, if you leave right now, I can save your life because my kinspeople, the Jews, know that you're a woman who is of worthy character. How? Because her natural world was in order. That in moments like this, we have to realize darkness is normal. We're not supposed to know the answers. It will pass. Don't panic and make decisions that make matters worse. Keep first things first. Get your natural world in order. And number four, and most importantly, trust the master of transition. In moments like this, we have to trust the master of transition. There are moments in our life that we have no expertise and we have no call and no say-so, and it's those moments that we surrender. If you've ever had surgery, you've surrendered to the expertise of the doctor. If you've ever had a baby, you likely surrendered to the expertise of the OBGYN who delivered the baby. If you've ever flown in a plane, you've definitely surrendered to the expertise of the pilot because you can't even see what's going on out of the front of that plane. That in moments like this, darkness is normal. It's not about figuring it all out. It's about knowing it will pass, and who do we trust in the middle of it? It's about getting our natural world in order to the best that we can, and at the end of the day, it's not a what we believe, it's a who do we trust. We can trust the master of that transition. We can trust it. Number five, stay incredibly focused on what you know God has called you to do today. Even if it's only one thing, do it heartily with everything you have. Stay incredibly focused on what you know God has called you to do today. Even if it's only one thing, do it with everything you got. Number six, if your heart is right, it will be all right eventually, even if we make the wrong decision. So don't get too enamored with getting everything perfect. It's not about that. It's about realizing darkness is normal. It will pass. It's about trusting the master of transition while keeping our natural world in order. That we should stay incredibly focused on what we do know God has called us to do today. Even if it's only one thing, do it with everything we have. And if our heart is right, it does all work together at the end of the day. This is Romans 8:28. It's a common scripture, but I think it's time for us to remind ourselves of this, not in a belief, but in a knowing. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. It doesn't say all things are good. It just says all things work together for good. It was true of Ruth. It's true of David. It's true of Solomon. It's true of Paul. It's true of Christ. And I think if we stop and examine ourselves, it's true of us as well, that we are not the exception to the rule. So a couple questions. That's my best effort explaining what happened. Let's ask a couple questions about what's happening in me right now because of what happened. One, are we trying to take a shortcut? Are we shortcutting God's way of doing something? Let's say it this way. Where have we allowed pragmatism to bypass wisdom and order? In this story, you have somebody trying to bypass wisdom and order for the sake of pragmatism, and you understand it. That person was Naomi. She cared about Ruth. Ruth didn't know. Ruth only knew what Naomi told her. Ruth's going with the information she has, but Naomi is trying to honor pragmatism over wisdom and order. Let's say it this way. Number 3, where do we need to take our next action step? In this story, Ruth's step was going to the threshing floor. The next step, as you read the story, it was going to the town gate. The next step was allowing the process to play out. The first step, though, was being kind, being generous, having integrity, being hardworking. Her natural world was in order because her redemption was based completely on the kindness of Boaz, but her reputation was determined by how she lived. So may we never confuse reputation with redemption, or we could be a bunch of forgiven people whose name means nothing, whose word means nothing. It's a problem. What's our next action step? Number 4, how are we handling transition that needs to change? Do we trust and obey? Number 5, how's our trust quotient? How's our trust quotient? Like we say we trust God. Most people wouldn't go another way with that. Oh, I trust God, sure. How though? How's your trust quotient? Do you trust God with yourself, but not with them? Can you trust God with yourself and them? Do you trust God with your eternal soul, but not your everyday daily bread? Or do you trust this, but not that? I love the Lord's Prayer. I'm going to be rewriting a whole series on it. And it's got 2 of the worst translations, though, into English. In the Lord's Prayer in English says, "My Father in heaven, hallowed be your name." Actually, in the original language, it's, "My Father who's as close to me as the air that I breathe. I stop and become aware of you." That's so much. Like, God is not in a faraway place. God is not an external existing object. Rather, he is insisting in all of us. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. That word daily is not in the original language. It's actually best translated, give us today transcendent bread. In other words, if you're going to translate it with a day, you got to do tomorrow, like give us today tomorrow's bread. In other words, in a world where everybody was poor, Jesus was saying, give us a bread that as soon as we finish eating it, we're not worried about the next loaf. Like, essentially, remove from us the fear of not having things. Remove from us the fear of lack. Where's our trust quotient? Can we check our heart, get advice, act, and then trust God with all the results? Because when we check our heart, we get advice, we act, and we trust God with the outcome, we become cooperators with God instead of manipulators of him. So my brothers and sisters, may we all be equipped to handle the seasons in life that inevitably come that are described by the middle of the night. Grace and peace, everybody.